Office, DCO, the Development Coordination Office in Bangkok. My region is Asia Pacific. I have 4 more counterparts. I think some of my counterparts will take care of other webinars. Today we are joined by Farah Bidi, who is in the Middle East, as is Heba. I will give them an opportunity to introduce themselves. And we have also a guest speaker from Vietnam, Hong. Heba, do you want to start? And then Farah and then Hong?
Yes, thank you so much, Luigi. But first, Farah, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Hiba. My name is Farah Bibi. I work with UNDCO Regional Office for Arab States. I'm program assistant and I'm supporting Hiba in the disability inclusion work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Farah. My name is Heba Khalif. I'm speaking to you from Egypt, Alexandria. So 2 people from the Middle East today. And I'm happy to be presenting to you today the topic about disability sensitization. And please, let's start with some housekeeping tips. Please note that this meeting is being recorded and transcribed, and we will share with you the meeting recording afterwards. And of course, we are very glad to have our guest speaker, Hung Dong, from Vietnam. She's a disability inclusion officer working in UNDP. Dong, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks, Heba. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Hương. I'm working here in UNDP Vietnam as a disability inclusion officer. My work is mainly with organizations of and for persons with disabilities and with Vietnam's government to make our policies and laws aligned with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and also building up capacities for stakeholders in terms of protecting rights of persons with disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you. So without further ado, let's go into the presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to write it down in the chat. Later on, we will open the mic for an interactive discussions. But now we will start the presentation. So if we go to the third slide, Farah, please, the agenda. So in the agenda, we are going first to start with disability definitions and some discussion about the disability movement. And then we will start by discussing the different types of disabilities, different types of impairments, I mean. We will also highlight forms of communication for persons with disabilities. And then we will conclude with interaction tips for how to interact with people with different impairments. And of course, we will include discussions in the interactive discussions throughout the webinar. Next slide. So according to the CRPD, persons with disabilities are persons who have long-term physical, sensory, mental, or intellectual impairments, which is when interaction with barriers hinders their full and effective participation on an equal basis with others. So that definition clearly highlights the difference between disability and impairment. Because impairments, when we combine impairments with accessibility, there will be no disability. But when we combine the impairments with barriers, the disability condition, the disabling factors are actually created. So now, for instance, if I were to type in the chat box some text, which is written in Arabic, you are not going to understand it. You are not going to perceive it. Farah and I are the only ones who are going to understand it. So this will create a disability for you because I presented the content to you in a way which is inaccessible. But if I were to offer a translation to you, you are going to perceive the text. So in the first case scenario, I created a disability by presenting the content in a way which is inaccessible to you. But in the second scenario, I removed this disability and removed this barrier. So that's why there's no disability created anymore. So if we move to the next slide. Um, if we move to the next slide, we have disability. Farah, can you please make sure that the mics are muted, please? So the disability movement has begun through a long journey. First of all, disability was looked at from a medical model perspective. Persons with disability were viewed as the cause of the problem. The individuals who have the disability, they are the ones who have the problem. They are the ones who have to learn to adapt and to fit in an inaccessible society which is not created for them. So this created a long history of marginalization and exclusion for persons with disabilities. And this also created communities which reflects this on the service provision organization facilities presented to people with disabilities, as it was presented from a charity-based approach, not from a human rights-based approach. But then when the social model of disability started emerging in the 1980s and 1990s by the disability movement advocates, it created a paradigm shift, and it shifted the perspective in which the disability inclusion is looked at, that societies are the ones that create disability when they do not provide accessible formats, accessible transportations, accessible employment and education for persons with disability. So that created a responsibility for all societies, communities, and organizations to transform their environment to be accessible. With the human rights-based model, which emerges along with the emergence of the CRPD, which entered into force in 2008, then it became a human right for everyone, including persons with disability, to enjoy equitable opportunities in education, employment, and social life. Next slide, please. So the human rights-based approach created the need to identify what is the appropriate language to use with people with disabilities. Because with the emergence of the social model and with the medical model, the language used to stress the disability, not the person. So we move to highlight and stress the concept to use the people first language, or the person first language, in order to shift the focus on the person and not the disability. Also, some people were using derogatory language or patronizing language, which makes people with disabilities feel that they are lesser beings other than their equal non-disabled peers. Or they viewed disability as something to be hidden, not to be discussed. So they used words like people with special needs or people who are differently able. All these words do not stress the importance of the human rights perspective in which disability is perceived, and also do not highlight the diversity and the unique identity of persons with disabilities. Next slide, please. So here in the people first language, there is an ongoing debate in the disability arena nowadays, whether to use identity first language or people first language. But in the United Nations, with official communications and formal communications, we have to use person's first language or people's first language. But I would like you to be mindful of that persons with disabilities might have different view about that. Some people might prefer to use identity first language. Like, for example, if you have a person with autism, he or she might like you to say he's autistic or she's autistic because they view disability as part of their identity. So in informal communication and non-official communication, always ask the person what his appropriate form of addressing, what is the appropriate way to address them, using either PFL, which is people first language, or IFL, which is identity first language. Next slide, please. So before talking about, do you have any questions up till this point before proceeding? Farah, do you have any questions? Yes, Luigi, please go ahead.
Sorry. I see a question in the chat. Do you want me to read it out for the audience as well?
Yes, please.
Okay, so Diane Felicite Maniku Namo. Sorry if I mangle your name. Huh? From the definition, does this mean everyone can be disabled? Is the definition not acknowledging vulnerability related to the impairment?
No, the definition is acknowledging the existence of an impairment, but we have to differentiate between vulnerability and impairments, because not all persons with disabilities are vulnerable. Oh, sorry, I had difficulty pronouncing this word. People with disabilities are vulnerable if they are poor, for instance, or if they experience difficult living conditions, or if they are living in societies which do not provide them with accessibility measures in place. So we cannot relate disability with vulnerability all the time. But the idea is the definition stresses on the importance of providing accessibility related measures and elimination of barrier, because that will lead to eliminate the disabling factors that creates the disability itself. Did this answer your question?
Are participants free to unmute and respond?
If you could you please, Luigi, could you go to the meeting option and let them, because I actually turned off the mic so that we could start our webinars, but now I guess we can open the mic for attendees if they want to respond.
Yes. Diane, feel free to unmute, huh?
Hello?
Yes?
Yes, we can hear you.
Sorry. Yeah, I was speaking in the heat. So, okay, I think I got it. Thank you very much. It's okay.
Okay, thank you very much. So, this slide about breaking down stereotypes. Before talking about stereotypes relating to disabilities, let's just think a little bit about stereotypes in general. So, what comes into your mind when you see the following words that are shared in the slides? These words are like nurse, scientist, alien, and lawyers. Yes. So if you could type in the chat, or if you could share with us the first thought that comes into your mind when you hear those words, that would be really great. For me, for instance, when I hear the word alien, I always imagine a species with red eyes and strange devices all over their body. That's how I perceive it. Could be wrong, of course. So Luigi, do we have anything in the chat?
No, just another question.
Okay.
I see a remark, profession, occupation, except C. Nurse,
Okay.
here they come, here they come. Nurse, white, clean, healthy. Scientist, white coats. Nurse is kind. Sea, sharks. Sea is peace. Different words of different types of groups. Lawyer, suit and tie. Sea, blue collar. Lawyers, lots of books. Nurse, hospital visit. Sea, warm vacation. Lawyer, expensive and lengthy process. Scientist, innovation. Alien, outer space. It comes to me as some form of qualification. Aliens, big eyes. Lawyers, justice. Lawyers, truth twisted. Sea,
Thank you.
coral.
Yes.
Scientist, eyeglasses. Aliens, green. Aliens, superpower.
So you see, each one of us have these stereotypes. Thank you very much, Luigi, for reading. So every one of us have some kind of a stereotypical idea about a group of people, about a certain profession, about people coming from a certain geographical location. This image that we are building inside our head might not be true in every case. Nurses are not always kind and professional and clean and helpful. Scientists do not always wear white coats and have eyeglasses on. Lawyers are not usually associated with justice. So uh, people tend to put the concepts and notions into categories and label those categories in the brain, because this is how our brain stores information. So we tend also to put people with disabilities into categories and label them with certain labels to fit our mental image. So for instance, we could say that people with autism are super geniuses, or people with visual impairment have super hearing, or people with hearing impairment have supervision. All that, these notions and all these stereotypes is of course inaccurate. So it is very important when we want to sensitize ourselves to disability is to question our own stereotype about persons with disabilities in order to make sure we have the correct understanding. So in the next slide, please. So in the next slide, in line with having to differentiate or to grasp the differences between persons with disabilities and the diverse nature of disabilities, we have a lot of forms of communicating with persons with disabilities and persons without disabilities as well. So first of all, of course, we have the spoken language, which is a communication method that is used by the majority of people. Then we have the sign language, which is used by people with hearing impairment, not only people with hearing impairment, but people with intellectual or mental impairments might use it as well. People with autism might use it as well. The other communication mode I would like to highlight is the PICS, or the Picture Exchange Information System, which is used by people on the spectrum, on the autism spectrum. It consists of some pictures binded in a folder. These pictures express the basic needs of any person, like the person is hungry, the person is sick, the person is sad, the person is happy, the person is tired, and so on. And people who are on the autism spectrum and who have speech impairments or nonverbals, they can just raise the picture that explains what they want to convey to the person in front of them. And then the person at the other end will also raise a picture with the response. So this is the PICS, or the picture information system. Also, we have lip reading, which is used by people with hearing impairments as well. And we have written formats, and the written formats differ from one person to another. Some people use Braille, some people use large print, which is text that is printed into large letters. Some people use regular print. So these are the forms of communication. So do we have any question?
Let me look at the chat, Heba. Before we did our little poll on these words, nurse, lawyer, etc., we had a question. Can we nominate non-UN participants from persons with disabilities to speak out about their views in this regards in the coming webinars? Thanks.
Thank you very much.
So
yeah, thank you very much. I'll get back to you on that. I'll reach out to my supervisors, and if that's okay, I can reach out personally to you to suggest persons participating in the webinar. Okay, so next, should we move to the next slide, or is there another question?
There is another question. Braille, is it a part of tactile signs?
No, Braille is not part of the tactile signs. Braille is the way of reading and writing for people with visual impairments, having the dots represented into raised line drawings or symbols. But the tactile signing is or pro-tactile is used by people who are deafblind. And with the tactile signing, we use something called hand under hand and hand over hand technique. So I will try to show you. Can you see my both hands?
Yeah, we can see.
Okay.
Yes, we can see.
The person who is speaking will have his hand upper to the person who is listening, and the person who is speaking will start signing, making the signs with his hands, and the person who is listening will touch the person's signing hand in order to listen as if they are listening. And then if the person who is listening wishes to speak, they will do this, and the person who is listening becomes the speaker and will start making the sign with their hands, and the other person will just listen. So we use this technique in order to communicate with persons who are deafblind. This is protactile or tactile signing.
Thank you so much, Hiba.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Any other questions?
Not at this moment.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we move to the next slide talking about different types of impairments. First of all, because we have to listen to our brain categorizing information into groups, we will do this now. So we have two main categories of impairments. We have the visible disabilities or visible impairments, and we have the non-apparent disabilities or invisible disabilities. So with the visible impairments, we can have persons who have physical sensory impairments, and it's very apparent and obvious. But with the invisible kind of disabilities, we might have persons who are neurodiverse, or who have a mental or intellectual impairment, or have a psychosocial disability. But it's important also to highlight that there are some people with visual impairment, for instance, but their impairment is not very obvious. So even persons with physical or sensory impairments, their disability might not be visible. So we have to also take into account the idea of that persons might have invisible disabilities that we don't know about. So the next slide asks a question: do you believe that there is a certain level of functionality that has to be present in order for any person to perform? And this level of functionality actually relating to their physical or cognitive or sensory conditions and functions?
Olga Silva says, yes, I do.
Okay, can you explain more why you think that is the case?
Olga, feel free to unmute. and or others? I see Mohammed and Dolly as well. Agree.
Yes, I feel there's a minimum functionality so that because we have to communicate between each other. So I think there is a minimum that we must understand and to be able to communicate and deal with each other.
Yes, but what do you mean by communicate? You mean using spoken language?
Yes, it can be spoken language or not, depending on the persons involved in that communication.
Yeah, so it can be spoken language, it can be sign language, it can be pictures, right?
Yes.
Yes.
But there has to be a minimum understanding between the people involved in that communication.
Yes, yes, agree. Yes, I agree. All right. Any other views? Please feel free to unmute and just speak up.
Yes, good morning, and thank you, Hiba and colleagues, for this very interesting webinar. Yes, I do believe there is a minimum level of functionality. For example, there are some type of disorders, like in my family we have uh, that the person the disability is preventing the person to think logically or to assess or to evaluate or to understand the surrounding normally. So in such type of disability, it's very difficult to put the person in, um, in a job when the person he lacks the ability to think logically or rationally. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, if the person cannot live independently or think independently, I guess they need a lot of rehabilitation and a lot of education in order to um, uh, to uh, you know to move to the next level. But don't you think that this might be due to that the person might need an extra education, an extra rehabilitation, extra therapy? Don't you think?
Yes, yes, I think yes, maybe we lack this type of education in our countries, but sometimes when I look at that person, she's a female. When I look at her and I think what type of job she can do, I feel like yes, there are certain jobs that does not require too much like mental engagement or brain
Yes,
like thinking normal thinking that yeah, that she can carry out. Like if I give her, yes, she can do. So I asked this question, I answered the question, and then I think I revoked my answer because yes, taking that example in my family member, there are certain things if I give to her, she can do it and she can repeat it and she can do it perfectly.
exactly. That's what I wanted you to say. So we have to give people the proper education and the proper therapy and the proper intervention services before we can judge whether they are able to perform at a certain job or not. For instance, let me give you an example. Now, if I'm a person with visual impairment right now, and let's say that my dream job is to be a driver, a car driver. Well, if I'm telling anybody that I want to be a car driver, actually, they will think I'm crazy. But look at what's happening right now. There are cars, self-driving cars, and there are cars which are now being developed depending on the GPS system and are running according to with the help of artificial intelligence and technology. Actually, these cars can drive themselves. So who knows? Maybe within 5 or 10 years, it would be pretty normal and an everyday thing to see a blind person or a visually impaired person driving a car. Then I would be the first one to apply for this job. So you can never know what technology might brings in the future because technology really transformed the lives of persons with disabilities and was making the impossible possible. For instance, few years ago, 10 years ago, I could not learn the colors of my clothes without asking my sighted family members. But now, because the assistive technology and the smartphones have a third-party software and a built-in technology that can identify, recognize, and say colors out loud, I don't depend on my family members anymore. I can just ask my smartphone instead. All right. Do you have any question before moving to the next point?
There's a few more remarks in the chat. I don't know if you want to respond or you're going to respond it afterwards.
It depends on the time, Luigi, because I'm not keeping the time. So you can respond to them later, if that's okay.
Okay.
So, so the next slide, please. We have a scenario here. What if you are an HR officer and you're announcing for a job, and you had a successful candidate. You held your interview online, and then after picking out the successful candidate in the first day of the job, you discover that this candidate has a physical disability. So what are you going to do? What procedures are you going to take to ensure this person's participation in the job, in equal and full participation?
Hello. I personally, I would be so proud to have seeing him at that condition, because with the change nowadays and inclusion of the people with disability, this is one way of be proud in the place of work to have people with the physical impairment. Uh, it will be my team and the organization task and mission to ensure that all necessary action are taken to ensure that the person is able to deliver the work and carry out the work, whether providing a physical, like some adjustment in the office, as well as in communication, to ensure that the person is able to communicate with others and come to the office safely and leave safely. And also not only to come and leave safely and to be happy and proud and to feel like he's a part or she's a part of the team. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very, very good points. Do anyone else have anything that you want to contribute?
There's some comments in the chat saying that they would make sure that they have accessibility and accommodation, and instead of making assumptions, to reach out to this person and define what their needs are in terms of accessibility and accommodation. Sorry, I cut someone off. Please go ahead.
No, it's all right. I was going to say the same.
Okay, so thank you very much for the comments. This is really good to provide accessible environment, but it's essential to consult with the person and ask the person about their needs, as mentioned, before providing the accessible environment, to make sure that this environment actually is catered for this person's needs. But how many of you will be taken aback a bit when you discover that this person is having a disability? Because this is something that we don't expect so often. We might actually feel this. Some of us might be a little bit taken aback because we are not very much exposed to disability in our lives. When you compare it to gender, we're all exposed to the gender and the gender-related issues because it touches every one of us personally. All of us knows about gender, are dealing with gender issues every day. But disability is different. So the exposure to persons with disabilities is very important in order to elevate this discomfort that we experience whenever we face someone with a disability for the first time. Next slide, please. There are certain myths. Yes.
There's
Yes.
two hands
Sorry.
raised. Do you want to park these hands?
Yeah.
And address them later?
No, please feel free to speak.
Okay, so Ahmed Abir, please go ahead.
I just wanted to raise one concern. Since in the HR staff, there should be an element or a component or a question in the application form to ensure that the person who is applying for the job, if he or she has a disability or not, so not to be surprised in after the selection, because sometimes some jobs might be viewed from the persons who are applying to the job, if they are able to do it, to go, for example, for field visits, if they are applying for an engineering job, while the employer might see it difficult if they would hire, for example, a person with a disability in this job. So because I have witnessed in certain instances that if they don't include such questions in the application form, and then upon hiring that person, they might be more or less like a touch, and they might affect the feeling of those people who have of those candidates who have successfully passed the interview and got to the job, but then the employer see that though they have disability, they will not be able, while the candidates see themselves that are competent and can do it. So I'm emphasizing on adding in the application form such questions: if you have a disability, what are kinds of disabilities, and such a thing, not to be surprised after selecting the candidates. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'll comment, or I will give the comments later on, because we will get into that in due course.
Do we have time for another hand?
Yes.
Okay. Wali Noor, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, hi, I just want to share my experience because I'm living in the UN compound and my flatmate is a person with physical disability. The organization provided all the facilities that to make his daily activity easy, including spatial arrangement for pickup, drop, and all that. But also what I found very important is, as a flatmate, also as a colleague, we also have to be very careful and supportive to not make the person feel of their disability, to make sure they are part of all the activities we are doing, and there are something which if there is something which he's not able to do, probably even to avoid it, it's not a big deal. And he is part of our normal physical exercises. He's partying, and to be honest, he really feels that he doesn't even feel of his disabilities. I just want to share that experience and make a big difference for the person. Thank you.
Thank you very much. What you said is really, really important, because the idea is, when we change our mindset about persons with disabilities and we view them as being able to control and to take decisions responsibly, that will lead us to change our views. All right, so because of the time, unfortunately, we have to move to the next slide about the myths of persons with disabilities. So this goes in line with the typical ideas that we have about persons with disabilities. So, for example, people might think that people with autism do not feel love, which is, of course, not true. They might express it differently. They might perceive feelings differently, but they can feel love all the same. The accessible toilets, for example, are not only beneficial for persons with physical impairments, but also for people with visual impairments. We have to make sure that the color of the background is in very high contrast with the colors of the things, all the things inside the toilet, because that will make it easier to see for a person with visual impairment, for instance. So because of the time, I cannot go through the myths, but there's a link at the end of the presentation with the resource page explaining the different impairments with myths related to them. So next slide. I think we already explained some interactions that some of you had about persons with disabilities. So I'm sure that having an interaction with a person with a disability on a daily basis clearly changes the person's point of view about disability. Because we see this person in his or her everyday actions, doing everyday tasks just as everyone else. So we change our view. Next slide. So the attitudinal barriers are one of the most important factors that can create either inclusion or exclusion. Because if we view persons with disabilities as inferior to us, as lesser beings who are incapable of controlling their own lives and actions, this will be reflected on the way we deal with them. Like, for instance, I'm a person with visual impairment. I used to work in a place where I was the only visually impaired person there. And whenever I travel independently inside the place, I'd find a person coming from nowhere trying to ask me where I want to go. Do I know the way? Um, do I need help? Well, this is very good. Offering help is really nice, and it shows a great feeling of solidarity. But at the same time, when I'm traveling independently and using my white cane, I'm totally focusing on my surroundings because I'm depending on my other senses to navigate my way in the place. So when a person talks to me, it clearly creates distortion. And also, whenever a person talks to me, and when people often assume that persons with disabilities need help all the time, this makes them feel a little bit patronized. So it is important to deal with persons with disabilities as equals. Um, Also, at the other end of the spectrum, people might think that persons with disabilities are superheroes. I know my colleague, he had a hearing impairment, and he was working as a graphic designer. And people would think that because he's doing his graphic designing job and he has a family and he has kids, that he is a superhuman, although he is doing something which is ordinary and which is everyone else does. So it is very important to know that people with disabilities might lack some functioning in some physical or bodily functions or some sensory functions, but they find a lot of ways to work around that, and they create new adaptive way of doing their everyday tasks. Also, the lack of awareness about disability and disability-related issues clearly affect the way we deal with persons with disabilities. So always try to be exposed to persons with disabilities. That's why in the UN we strive to make organizations and agencies, and we urge them to employ persons with disabilities because this will increase exposure and this will increase awareness. Also, as we discussed, the idea of uh, uh, empathy, not sympathy. It is very good if you can understand how I feel, but without you looking down on me and without making me feel that I'm incapable or helpless or anything like this. Also, some people might think that because I'm blind, because I'm visually impaired or I have a visual impairment, that I have also a hearing impairment. So this multi-sensory effect, people would talk about me while I'm there in the room without thinking about it. So when a person has a certain impairment in one sense, uh, they can make use of their other senses perfectly fine. Next slide, please. So that's a simple guide in order to help you interact with persons with disabilities. I want to highlight a couple of points here, which is related to persons with intellectual disabilities. Um, 5 seconds rule. If you are in contact with a person with intellectual disability and you initiated a contact with them, always wait 5 3 to 5 seconds for their response, because their brain processes the information differently, and they might take time to process your request and to initiate the appropriate response. So always wait 5 seconds before expecting a response. Also, try to talk to the person, not the sign language or the companion, because when you're dealing with a person with hearing impairment, for instance, and you're talking to the signer, not the person himself or herself, this is not good, because actually the sign language interpreter is not part of the conversation. He's just signing for the person in order to be able to understand you. Okay, next slide. Next slide, please. The interview with a person with visual impairment. All right, so suppose you have an interview and your candidate is a person with visual impairment, and you would like to guide this person to the interview place. What are you going to do? What strategy are you going to take? Please feel free to unmute or type in the chat.
I'll probably ask them if they need help being guided to the place.
Any other comments? Thank you. Any other comments?
Actually, since this is a new, let's say, workplace for them or a new work environment, I might ask them for the first time if they want any assistance. If they say no, then I will just guide them to the meeting room or to the hall that you follow this direction and you will reach. Unless they want any assistance, maybe we can provide them with it.
That is great. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
As an HR officer in the application, there should be a place where it indicates whether there is any impairment that the candidate has. So this should as an HR officer, I should put this into my consideration when I'm receiving the person or when I'm recruiting the person. Based on that, before even the person step into the compound or come to the office, I should take the necessary action to provide all the appropriate access and place and stairs and ground to receive. I mean, it should not be the other way around. I should first prepare the place and then receive the person. And as an HR officer, I should be aware, because it's an application, that will not deny his right or her right to be employed, but I need to know to support the person to be part of the work team. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. So now I will give the floor to my colleague Hong Dong to try to highlight some points and to speak as a person, as she's a person with visual impairment as well. The floor is yours, Hong.
Thank you, Heba. Hello, everyone again. Yeah, I myself am also a person with visual impairment, and now I would like to share with you some tips to interact with persons with visual impairments. As you already know and agree that we should ask that person whether he or she needs help, and then there are some needs that we can there are some help that we can offer to persons with visual impairments. For example, sighted guide. Normally, you just offer your elbow for that person to grab and inform your colleague about the change in the terrain. For example, upstairs, downstairs, and because of the time limit, I can't tell you all things related to sighted guide, but I already put a link to the video that you can watch to know how to guide a person with visual impairment. When a colleague with visual impairment got on board, you can offer him or her a mobility and orientation training. It is necessary for them to get around a new environment and locate the meeting room, the office, duty workstation, etc. in the building. The accessible materials are very important for persons with visual impairments. Heba and I are using the computer with the screen reader, and we use the same formats as you are using, like PDF, Word, surfing the internet, etc. But it is very important that the websites and the documents are designed with accessible features like headings or text to describe the pictures and diagrams in the documents for us, so that we can perceive most information like you in a document. Now, related to daily conversation, when you first meet a person with visual impairment, please introduce yourself, like your name, your unit, so that your colleague can recognize your voice and your figure. Next time, he can recognize you. When you are talking to a person with visual impairment, please remember to inform him or her when you are leaving, so that your colleague will not talk to the air when you are leaving. In a meeting or an event, it is very helpful if you can describe the visual cues or the context for your colleagues with visual impairments. For example, when everyone is looking at their mobile phones, texting, but when the leader comes in, everyone suddenly becomes quiet. So it's very important to convey that information to your colleague with visual impairments. For another example might be, in a meeting, someone makes some funny gesture. So if you can describe it to your colleague, it would be with visual impairment, it would be great for him or her to perceive and join you in that joyful moment. One thing, it is very general, not only for persons with visual impairments, but for persons with disabilities in general. They are very open to talk about their disabilities, but please keep in mind that if your curiosity about their disabilities is appropriate in your conversation. For example, if you want to know about the barriers or the accessibility needs, so that you can make reasonable accommodations for them at work, it would be very helpful. However, if you are just curious and assume that your colleagues can't do anything, and you want to know about the causes, the diseases of the impairments, and give them advice on the treatment, maybe it is not really appropriate conversation at work. So those are some tips that I want to share. And now I would like to give the floor back to Heba. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Hong, for this very informative intervention. Thank you, thank you. Do you have any questions, colleagues? Do you have any questions before proceeding?
From the chat, great tips, thank you. This is coming from Nikita Shabayev. Is there any list of items that we must ask or must check to create the accessible environment? Usually UN entities don't know how to communicate correctly with people with disabilities. They ask a really question, how do we define the reasonable accommodation? So the list would be great of help. Yeah, I think this pertains to previous topics.
Yes. Okay. Well, in the practice notes that are currently being reviewed, developed by the BOSS Disability Inclusion and Business Operations Support Team, we are listing some reasonable accommodations when it comes to assistive technology that might be helpful for persons with different impairments. But also, if you would like to, and also in the physical accessibility practice notes, we talk about providing accessible environments using the BOS, Disability Inclusion Accessible Physical Accessibility Techniques document, which is developed as well in partnership with the UNICEF. So we already have some documents. We can share them with you after the presentation that explains more about reasonable accommodations. And I want to highlight a point mentioned by Ho, that when you are developing a job application, yes, of course, you have to know beforehand about the reasonable accommodation the person might be needing. So it would be very good to ask when you're asking in your application to ask if the person has any reasonable accommodation requirements. So instead of asking if the person has a disability or not, you can ask what type of personal accommodation do you require, and you can put a list that the person can choose from, or you can put a box for persons to type in information. So you can say, do you require a screen reader? Do you require a sign language interpreter? Do you require a sighted guide? Do you require flexible work arrangements? All this is an example for reasonable accommodations that persons might require. In the next slide, I'm presenting you something we call a clock face technique, or maybe it was the previous slide, I'm not sure. And the clock face technique is used by persons with visual impairment to get familiarized with their environment or their surroundings. Imagine that you are facing a clock. So if you are facing a clock with the handles, the clock plate, the number 6 would be directly in front of you. Number 12 will be facing away from you, straight ahead, but facing away from you. And number 3 is going to be on your right. Number 9 is going to be on your left. So when you want to tell a person that there is a table at 12 o'clock, they will understand that this table exactly is in front of them, but facing away from them. But if you're telling a person that there's a table at 6 o'clock, they will understand this table is directly in front of them, facing towards them. So the clock face technique is very helpful when you are in a meeting and you want to direct or familiarize the person with a room or with the persons around them who is sitting at 12 o'clock, who is sitting at 3, at 9, at 6. So you're using these clock face techniques to familiarize users, individuals with visual impairment with their environment. And of course, it's also useful in other settings, like in dining and meals and so on. Next slide, please. The one about sign language interpreter. So I'm just mindful of the time. We have little time left, so I'm unable to hold all the interactive questions as I like to. But I will speak about persons with hearing impairment. The next slide, interacting with persons with hearing impairment. Always direct your speech to the person, not the sign language interpreter. Be mindful of the lighting and the seating positions. Be sure to make the person with a hearing impairment and the signer sitting facing the light source. Don't make the light source come from behind the person signing, because this way will create shadows that will not that the person with hearing impairment will not be able to see the gestures and signs clearly. Also, if the person with hearing impairment is a lip reader, be sure to sit directly in front of them and make your face and your upper body non-obscure from his line of vision. So make the line of vision between him and your face and upper body clear so that he can see or she can see your lips. Always try not to talk over one another, so that it will enable sign language interpreters to interpret and enable lip readers to follow the conversation. If you be mindful of the person's facial expressions. If you felt that a person did not understand something which is being said in the conversation, please try to repeat it, and in order to make the person feel included. In the next slide, we will also go to the following one, interacting with a person who is neurodiverse, this is very important. People who are neurodiverse are a diverse group of people with unique and individual needs and requirements. So we have to be mindful of a number of things. First, lighting is very important. Visual stimulations might trigger unfavorable reactions with people who are on the autism spectrum. So always try to not to use flashy lights, because this might trigger seizure reactions. Don't avoid using the neon lights, because this creates a humming noise, which clearly disturbing for them. Also, provide quiet areas for relaxation periods and frequent breaks, because people who are neurodiverse get overloaded with social interactions and with audio and visual stimuli coming from the environment. So it's always helpful for them to have quiet areas. Always be mindful of the seating of the person who is neurodiverse. Some people like to sit in an enclosed glass cabinets to feel that they have their own space. Some prefer to sit at the back of the room. Some prefer to sit near the light. Ask the person, of course. You ask the person what their preferred sitting position is. Very important, fluctuating energy level is one of the features or one of the things that people who are neurodiverse experience. And we mean that if a person who is neurodiverse goes to work every day, interacts with people every day, and have a work or after working hours gathering, this creates an overload on their nervous system. That's why on the next day, they might not be feeling able to perform or to work because their nervous system is overloaded. So that's why they might need flexible work arrangements, because their energy level fluctuates. One day they might be upbeat, performing very, very well, very active, very interactive with their colleagues. But the second day they would be a little bit distant, want to sit a little bit by themselves because they are overloaded. As we said, background noise is very important. So if you have a fan which is humming, or air conditioning, or things like that. It's always helpful to choose a place for a person who is neurodiverse to sit without as much background noise as possible, in order for them to be able to perform. And of course, I would like to remind you that these are only some general guidelines, but it may be different from one person to another, because as I said, persons who are neurodiverse is very, very diverse. So you have to ask the person before applying any kind of reasonable accommodations. Keeping a daily routine and daily schedule is very important for people who are on the autism spectrum, because this is how they feel secure and safe, having a predictable daily routine. That's because humans are very unpredictable, and this creates an sense of insecurity for them. So having a daily routine is very, very helpful. You also have to be mindful of the communicational preference for persons who are neurodiverse. Some of them might prefer written modality of communication, some of them might prefer spoken language, and some of them might use sign language as well. So do you have any questions before going to the general tips?
Heba, I see a hand raised.
Yes, please.
Okay. I'm interested to know the answer to the question you raised concerning an interview panel sitting there and the interpreter fails to turn up. I'm keen to know the answer to that question. It's very, very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right. So if you have a situation like that, first of all, present the person with hearing impairment with a pen and paper. See if they are able to communicate using writing. If not, you can use body language or gestures to try to communicate. If this, but of course, I assume that if a person is coming to work in a job, he or she is have a good writing skills. So always present them with a pen and paper. Does this answer your question?
Yes, but I would like to know whether it will be ethical for me to postpone this interview until the interpreter is available.
Yes, of course you can do that if you know that the interview is not going, the sign language interpreter is not going to show up at all. But I meant that the interpreter is just, is a little bit late for a few minutes. But of course, if the interpreter will not show up, it's good to postpone the interview so that the person with hearing impairment would have a fair chance of being interviewed. Having equitable conditions for doing the interview. But if the sign language person is late for a few minutes, you can just present the person with a pen and paper and just start exchanging some general communication till this person arrives, the sign language interpreter arrives.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very clear.
Thank you. So in the general tips, we already discussed some tips before with Hong. She kindly she kindly explained those tips. So you move to the next slide. This is very, very important. If you have a person with a disability in your work colleagues, please avoid discussing his or her disability amongst your group, because you have to take their consent before discuss. For example, if you have a work colleague who felt confident and disclosed to you their disability, you cannot go to your supervisor immediately and tell them that this colleague has this kind of disability. You have to take the colleague's consent first before going to your supervisor and informing them about that, in order to secure, for example, some reasonable accommodations of flexible work arrangements of the colleague. So disability disclosure is not obligatory, and colleagues don't have to disclose if they don't choose to. We already covered that. Okay. So in the next slide, I want to ask you, what if you are the person with a disability? Would you want people to treat you differently? What would you feel? I'd like you to open your microphone and just start speak up if you feel you want to do that. So for example, let's rephrase the question in another way. Do you know a person who didn't have a disability and suddenly this person unfortunately was struck by an illness or accident and became had an impairment? Do you think that people would treat them differently?
Okay, for me, I think they would be treated differently, because that is all about the reasonable accommodations that are required, so that also they can be included in the various processes or anything that we are doing at work. So if you treat them as things are okay when they are not, then at the end of the day, we are not being inclusive, which is the objective that we want to achieve now, to be as accommodative as possible and also as inclusive as possible. Over.
Thank you. Any other contributions? If not, we can go to the next slide. Should we go, Luigi, should we go to the next slide?
Sorry. No, also tying into what your previous question, there has been a comment slash question in the chat from a colleague, Gauri Shankar Sabeshwaran, saying, I'm temporarily disabled due to viral fever, etc., unable to walk and have become immobile. What can I expect from my office when I return to office after some time? So this colleague is clearly expecting others to view things differently, and also coming back to the requirements for accommodation and facilitation. Other than that, yes, there's tons of other questions and remarks in the chat, but not directly related to what you just said.
Okay, I will conclude and then we can address the questions. All I want to say is, yes, so if we move to the next slide in order to be able to conclude. No, the next one, the include model. So all I want to say is that we have to identify the person's needs and requirement. We have to nourish their independence. We have to collaborate with them in order to create an inclusive working environment. We have to listen to their opinions because this is very, very important. We have to unite with them towards a common goal, make them part of any issues not only relating to disability inclusion, but also relating to the general goals and objectives of the organization itself. We have to discuss with them regularly and hold one-to-one check-ins with them. If you are an HR officer and you have a person with a disability working in your organization, be sure to hold regular check-ins with that person to make sure the person is okay, because we are very good at something what we call masking. We can be very anxious, we can be very stressed, and we can have a high level of uncertainty and self-doubt, especially in new environments. But at the same time, we are exposing a quiet demeanor with a smiling face. So we tend to mask our true feelings in order to show that we are okay. So always be sure to check in with persons with disabilities. Also empower them by giving them the lead and by consulting them in any other issues, not only relating to disability inclusion. I wanted just to say something in relation to the fact about the person who has a temporary impairment. Yes, people views actually change when and people perception and people way of dealing with people with disabilities change if these people suddenly if the onset of disability occurs in the middle of the person's life. I know a colleague, he is visually impaired. He has a visual impairment, and he was okay till he was 39 years old. He was a family man with 3 children, working in an excellent job. And then when he lost his job, even his family members deal with him as if he's incapable of doing the very simple day life tasks, simply because they think, how can he does it without vision? So we have assumptions about persons with disabilities. We look at people with disabilities from our own eyes, not from their eyes. So if you look at a picture from another's person's angle, you are not going to see the whole picture. You have to look at you have to look at the picture from a holistic view. So it's better to have the person with disability explain to you how he or she would like things to be done. What exactly can this person do? What exactly can this person not do? What kind of support does he need from you or from any part of any member of the team in order for him to feel included? It is very important not only to include the persons with disabilities in daily tasks, but also in social gatherings outside working hours, because you can have the policies and the regulations and the laws and the governing documents urging and um, creating all the conditions to provide accessible and inclusive environment. But at the same time, people with disabilities are first and foremost people. They want to feel really that they are part of your team and that they are included and that they belong. Thank you very much. That's all from me today. I'm ready to answer the question in the remaining time, if you have time.
Thank you, Hiba, for this. Actually, it's not a question, it's just a small comment. I encourage every office to recruit people with disability. They are really source of inspiration for everyone. If a person with disability was able to attend an online interview for a position of NO, national professional, and provided all the university credential and were able to compete and get the job, this person should be recruited as a hero in the office, because a person like this may like to make other people, normal people, feel disabled, not him or her. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Luigi, do we have any? You said that there were questions, right? I'm not sure. I can't read them, unfortunately.
Okay, let's see. Going back up. Please assist on how to give directions to a blind person. For instance, you cannot say, go straight ahead, because the person does not see it all. Please help. I think that's just a comment. A question: is clinical depression a disability under psychosocial illnesses?
Yes, I believe it is.
Another question: does it have to be mentioned in job advertisement so that this job is open for people with disabilities as well?
Yes, and a statement encouraging people with disabilities to apply is very essential in any job application because it will encourage candidates to apply. Yes.
Yep. Another question: should ICT colleagues be trained on digital accessibility?
Yes, and we will have a webinar about this in due course.
Is there a resource guideline available on how we can provide good alternative text for documents?
Yes, there is, and we'll be sharing it in the ICT webinar.
Great. Did you guys have samples of video introduction to a newcomer to join interviews? Where the UN has free facility to be offered to UN agencies to use translate to review documents to user-friendly to PWD. It's a bit vague. I'm not sure how to interpret this question. So they're asking for samples or video introductions to any disabled people, incoming onboarded colleagues with disabilities. But I don't understand free facility to be offered to UN agencies to use to translate. Okay. So are there options for free translation or converting documents to make them accessible for people with disabilities?
Okay, as for the first question, there's the UN Secretary Staff College has a UNDIS course, which gives a very good introduction about persons with disabilities and disabilities in general. So it's very good for newcomers to take this online course, and it's free. For the second question, in the ICT webinar, we are going to learn how to create accessible documents, so it will be easy for everyone to do it. It's not difficult at all.
Great. So everybody stay tuned for other webinars in this regard. Let me go back to the questions. This goes back to our exercise. What do we do if someone's being boarded? There's another question back on mental illnesses. What kind of mental illness can be considered an impairment? I mean, all of them can be considered impairing, but which ones can be viewed from a disability point of view in a manner that warrants them reasonable accommodation?
Well, it depends, of course, on the impairment and the condition itself. Like persons who are bipolar, for instance, they require special accommodations. Persons who have clinical depression, persons who have ADHD. It depends on the person and what they need. And yeah. So it has to be taken on a case-by-case basis.
Gotcha. I think we're also running out of time, huh?
Yes. I'd like also to mention the feedback survey. Can you, Farah, if you could please share the feedback survey in the chat, because your feedback is very, very important to us, and we would love to hear from you. That would be really, really great.
Thank you. One final question, Heba.
Yes, Luigi. Yes.
Should we say disabled people, or should we say people with disabilities?
No, according to the people first language, yes, according to the people first language approach, we should say persons with disabilities, and we should not really use the word PWD, because the word PWD objectifies persons with disabilities. We should use the whole sentence.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luigi, for your support and for your moderation today. I really, really appreciate it. And thank you very much, Farah, for supporting me with the presentation and with the visual parts and with everything. Thank you, Farah.
I see one final hand. Is there time for it, or do you want to close this off?
I think we have a minute, I think.
Okay. Nahanshon.
This is Nahashon. Just one comment. Hope I'm audible enough.
Yes, we can hear you perfectly.
Yeah, yes. Just to echo what has been presented. It's quite an impressive and comprehensive presentation. I think one thing that we might notice that HR at various organizations have a very key role in enhancing disability inclusion. Especially when it comes to various policies, the documentations and other relevant guidelines, but then also at the social aspect and organization arrangements. But then one key thing to note is that disability is not homogeneous, which means it's more or less people with disability experience challenges and difficulties at different levels. And therefore, when it comes to considerations and reasonable accommodations, apart from the usual accessibilities arrangements and organizational arrangements in terms of accessibility for persons with disabilities, it's more or less paying attention to individuals with disabilities. So each individual with disability should be able to requested to share aspects of reasonable conditions that they require, and also when it comes to interaction level, then it means that you can interact differently with each person with disabilities at a different level, as then disability is more or less not homogeneous. Thanks. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the valuable input and comments. Yes, that's goes in line very well with what we have been saying. Thank you very much for sharing your points and your comments. And thank you everyone for joining. I'll give it over to you, Luigi, to conclude.
Thank you. Yes, colleagues, guys, gals, non-binary pals, thank you for attending. I'm sure we missed a few questions and or remarks. Do not despair. We look back in the chat and make sure that everything gets answered. As promised, we're going to share the recording and share any of the presentation materials and other guidance documents being asked for. As also mentioned before, please stay tuned for other webinars. We're going to delve into the ICT aspect of making documents accessible for other colleagues with impairments and that sort of thing. So please keep your eye out if not already registered. I think that's it. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Hong. Thank you, Heba. Thank you, Farah. And thank everyone for being in here.
Thank you so much.
Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.